Blood pooled beneath the Norman king as his warhorse stumbled through smouldering timber, the pommel of his saddle driving deep into his swollen gut like a mailed fist. The fall at Mantes on July 20th, 1087, would prove more decisive than any battlefield victory William had claimed in 6 decades of conquest. Quick favor. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. It helps us see the global reach of this story. The morning had begun with familiar brutality. William's forces had torched the rebel stronghold of Mantes, reducing its timber fortifications to glowing coals and ash-choked air. At 59, the Conqueror's body bore the accumulated weight of 30 years ruling through fear and violence. His once powerful frame had thickened into something approaching monstrosity, his belly straining against mail and leather with each labored breath. The French mockingly called him William the Fat, though never within sword's reach. But on this scorching July morning, as smoke from the burning town stung his eyes and filled his lungs, William drove his destrier forward through the ruins with characteristic ruthlessness. The rebels had dared question his authority over the Norman borderlands. They would learn, as so many had before, that defying the bastard of Falaise carried consequences measured in blood and ash. The horse, a massive Norman charger bred for war, picked its way carefully through the debris-strewn streets. Fallen beams jutted from collapsed buildings like broken bones. The acrid stench of burned thatch mixed with something far worse, the sweet corruption of flesh caught in the flames. William's knights followed at a cautious distance, their own mounts nervous among the smouldering ruins. What happened next would be debated by chroniclers for centuries. Did the horse stumble over a hidden timber, its hoof catching in the gap between 2 charred beams? Did the animal shy at some sudden sound? Perhaps the groan of a collapsing wall or the cry of someone still trapped in the wreckage. The exact cause mattered less than the catastrophic result. The destrier pitched forward violently, its massive head driving toward the ground. William, caught off guard by his mount's sudden movement, was thrown against the iron pommel of his war saddle with tremendous force. The impact drove the curved metal deep into his abdomen, just below the ribs, where his accumulated fat offered little protection against the blow. The king's scream echoed off the blackened stone walls surrounding them, a sound his knights would remember for the rest of their lives. Not the controlled roar of a warrior in battle, but something primal and helpless, the cry of a man suddenly confronting his own mortality. William slumped forward in his saddle, both hands pressed against his belly, where blood already seeped through the links of his mail. His face had gone ashen beneath his helmet, beads of sweat mixing with soot on his broad forehead. The horse, sensing its rider's distress, stood trembling among the ruins, while smoke continued to rise around them. "My lord!" The cry came from Gilbert de Clare, William's standard-bearer, who spurred his horse forward through the debris. But even as the knight approached, he could see the damage was severe. Dark stains spread across the king's surcoat, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. The irony was not lost on those who witnessed it. William had conquered England through superior cavalry tactics, his mounted knights crushing Harold's infantry at Hastings 21 years earlier. Now his own horse had delivered what might prove a mortal wound, here among the smoking ruins of another burned town in another pointless border war. Within minutes, William's physician had been summoned from the baggage train. The man's face went pale as he examined the king's injuries, his hands coming away bloody from the torn flesh beneath the mail. "Internal damage," he whispered to the assembled knights. "Possible rupture of the bowel." The king needed immediate rest and expert treatment, neither of which could be provided in this devastated wasteland. But what could have healed such a wound in 1087? Medieval medicine understood little of internal injuries beyond the obvious fact that men died from them. The physician could offer only prayers, poultices, and increasingly desperate remedies as infection set in. As William's men fashioned a litter from salvaged timber and cloth, the king himself seemed to grasp the severity of his situation. His eyes, usually sharp with calculation and controlled fury, had taken on a different quality. Not fear exactly, but a grim recognition that this time raw determination might not be enough. The greatest conqueror in Christendom was about to discover that some enemies could not be defeated with sword and fire. The 50-kilometer journey to Rouen became a procession of agony, each jolt of the litter sending fresh waves of fire through William's ruptured abdomen. What had begun as a routine military campaign now threatened to unravel the greatest empire in Western Europe through the random stumble of a warhorse. The makeshift litter swayed sickeningly as William's bearers navigated the rutted roads leading north toward Normandy's capital. Rough-hewn planks served as the frame, hastily lashed together with leather straps and covered with whatever cloth could be salvaged from the baggage train. No amount of padding could cushion the impact as wooden wheels struck stones or dropped into cart ruts carved deep by decades of traffic. William lay on his back, both hands pressed against the spreading stain across his belly. His mail had been removed, revealing the true extent of the damage, a livid bruise that extended from his lower ribs to his navel, with an ugly puncture where the pommel had driven deepest. Blood seeped continuously through the linen bandages his physician had applied, and each breath came as a visible effort. The heat of early August made the journey even more unbearable. Dust kicked up by the escort's horses settled on everything, including the king's wounds, while flies drawn by the scent of blood buzzed persistently around the litter. William's physician rode alongside, periodically checking his patient's condition and whispering increasingly worried consultations with the other learned men in the royal household. But perhaps worse than the physical torment was the psychological reality now settling over the Norman court. For 21 years, William's will had been absolute law across two kingdoms. Barons, bishops, and common soldiers alike had organized their entire existence around avoiding his legendary wrath. Now, reduced to helpless groaning on a blood-stained litter, the Conqueror appeared suddenly, terrifyingly mortal. Whispered conversations spread through the column of riders. What would happen to England if William died? His eldest son, Robert Curthose, held nominal authority over Normandy, but the young man had already proven himself unreliable, even rebellious. William Rufus, the second son, controlled significant territory in England, but lacked his father's crushing presence. And young Henry, barely 19, possessed nothing but sharp intelligence and dangerous ambition. The political implications grew more ominous with each passing mile. Without William's iron grip holding the Anglo-Norman realm together, civil war seemed inevitable. The English barons, many of whom still resented Norman rule, might see an opportunity to reclaim their independence. Viking raiders could return to harass the coasts. Most terrifyingly, Philip of France, William's nominal overlord and persistent enemy, would certainly exploit any succession crisis to reclaim Norman territories. By the time Rouen's stone towers appeared on the horizon, William's condition had visibly worsened. The steady bleeding continued, despite all efforts to staunch it, and fever had begun to set in. His face, normally ruddy from years of outdoor campaigning, had taken on a waxy pallor that made his grey beard appear almost white by contrast. The priory of Saint-Gervais sat on the outskirts of Rouen, its solid Norman architecture promising the peace and expert care William desperately needed. But even the short journey from the city gates to the priory's entrance proved nearly unbearable. The litter bearers moved with exaggerated care, Yet still William cried out as each step sent fresh jolts through his damaged body. Inside the priory's guest quarters, the full extent of the crisis became apparent. The king's personal physician, Brother Geoffrey, had trained at the medical schools of Salerno, the finest available in Western Europe. Yet, as he examined William's wounds by candlelight, his expression grew increasingly grave. The external puncture was bad enough, but the internal damage appeared far worse. Medieval understanding of abdominal injuries remained primitive, but Geoffrey recognized the symptoms of peritonitis beginning to set in. The king's belly had begun to swell and harden, a sign that infected fluids were spreading through the abdominal cavity. His temperature rose steadily, and by the third day at Saint-Gervais, William was experiencing the alternating chills and sweats that marked severe infection. The priory's other monks gathered to offer what assistance they could. Prayers were said continuously in the chapel. The finest wines were brought to ease William's pain. Poultices of herbs and precious spices, myrrh, frankincense, costly imports from the Holy Land, were applied to the wound with desperate hope. Yet, nothing could halt the inexorable progression of internal corruption spreading through the Conqueror's body. The stench from his infected abdomen grew so overwhelming that servants had to burn incense constantly just to make the sick room bearable. As August wore on, one thing became terrifyingly clear to everyone in William's household. The greatest military commander of his generation was losing his final battle. William's screams now echoed through Saint-Gervais Priory at all hours, his infected abdomen swelling until even silk bedsheets felt like chainmail against his rotting flesh. The political vultures were already circling, but first they had to endure the horrifying spectacle of watching Europe's most feared king dissolve from within. By mid-August, the priory had transformed into something resembling a charnel house disguised as a royal court. The stone walls, built to offer sanctuary and peace, now contained scenes that would have made battlefield veterans blanch. William's chamber reeked of suppuration despite the constant burning of expensive frankincense. Servants entered only when absolutely necessary, pressing perfumed cloths to their faces to block the stench of decay that seemed to seep from the very stones. The king's physician had exhausted his limited arsenal of treatments. Poultices of wine and myrrh were reapplied twice daily, but they seemed only to spread the infection rather than contain it. The swelling in William's abdomen had grown so severe that his nightclothes had to be cut away entirely. Even the lightest fabric caused excruciating pain when it touched the distended flesh. Brother Geoffrey's medical training had prepared him for battlefield wounds, broken bones, even the plague. But this slow corruption, eating away at the Conqueror's body, defied every remedy in his repertoire. The king's bowels had ceased functioning properly, alternating between complete constipation and violent bloody flux that left him weakened and humiliated. Sleep became impossible as muscle spasms racked his torso without warning. Yet even in agony, William's political instincts remained sharp. On August 15th, despite barely being able to hold a quill, he dictated his final charter confirming gifts to the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen, the same monastery where he had married Matilda of Flanders 36 years earlier. The document's shaky seal revealed the effort required for even this simple act of statecraft. But where was his heir? Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy and William's eldest son, remained conspicuously absent from his father's deathbed. The young man had been campaigning in the contested territories along Normandy's eastern border, but surely news of the king's condition had reached him by now. His continued absence sparked increasingly bitter speculation among the Norman nobility gathered at Saint-Gervais. Some whispered that Robert was deliberately avoiding Rouen, perhaps hoping his father would die before he was forced to make any uncomfortable deathbed promises about future governance. Others suggested he was already consolidating power in his Norman strongholds, preparing for the inevitable succession struggle. The most cynical courtiers wondered if Robert might actually prefer his father's death. It would free him from the crushing burden of living in William's shadow. William Rufus, the king's second son, had shown no such hesitation. Word had been sent to his estates in England, and by late August he was riding hard toward Normandy with a select group of trusted knights. Unlike his older brother, Rufus understood that presence at the deathbed could determine the future of kingdoms. The political mathematics were becoming increasingly clear to those with eyes to see. England needed a strong ruler, someone capable of maintaining Norman dominance over the still restive Saxon population. Robert, for all his legitimate claims as eldest son, had proven himself weak and unreliable during previous crises. Rufus, though younger, possessed more of his father's ruthless pragmatism. As for Henry, the youngest son, he remained a wild card in this deadly game. At 19, he controlled no significant territories and commanded no great following among the barons. Yet those who knew him recognized a dangerous intelligence burning behind his youthful features. Henry was watching, learning, waiting for his moment. The atmosphere at Saint-Gervais grew increasingly tense as September approached. Norman lords, who had traveled from across the duchy to pay their respects to the dying king, found themselves drawn into hushed conversations about the future. Alliances were quietly discussed. Promises were carefully negotiated. The machinery of medieval politics ground forward even as William lay writhing in his infected bedchamber. The king himself remained acutely aware of these machinations. During his increasingly rare moments of lucidity, he would summon various nobles to his bedside, probing their loyalties and testing their resolve. His eyes, sunken deep into a face now gaunt with pain and fever, still held enough of their old fire to make even hardened warriors uncomfortable. But could sheer willpower overcome the corruption spreading through his body? William had built his entire career on the principle that determination and ruthlessness could conquer any obstacle. Now he faced an enemy that cared nothing for titles, territories, or the fear he had spent decades cultivating. The Conqueror was about to learn whether death itself could be intimidated into submission. By September 1st, William's voice had been reduced to a rasping whisper, yet he still commanded the fate of 2 kingdoms, with each labored breath from his putrefying deathbed. The dying king was about to demonstrate that even mortal agony could not break a lifetime's habit of absolute control over men's destinies. The chamber at Saint-Gervais had become a grotesque parody of a royal court. Nobles knelt beside what had once been the most feared throne room in Christendom, now nothing more than a blood-stained mattress surrounded by the overwhelming stench of internal rot. William's abdomen had swollen so severely that Brother Geoffrey feared any sudden movement might cause the infected tissue to rupture completely, filling the room with putrid matter. Yet, when William Rufus finally arrived from England on September 1st, dusty and exhausted from his desperate ride across the Channel, his father's eyes blazed with something approaching their old authority. The second son approached the bed with visible reluctance, pressing a perfumed cloth to his nose as the full horror of his father's condition became apparent. "Kneel," William commanded in a voice like grinding stone. Rufus obeyed immediately, his warrior's instinct still responding to that tone, despite its obvious weakness. Around the chamber, other nobles leaned forward to catch every word of what might prove to be crucial political testament. But where was Robert? Even now, with his father clearly dying, the Duke of Normandy remained absent from Rouen. William's jaw tightened with familiar rage, an expression that seemed almost obscene on his fever-wasted features. How dare his eldest son show such disrespect at this final hour? How dare he force a dying king to make succession plans around his absence? The political implications grew more dangerous with each passing day. Norman law traditionally favored the eldest son, giving Robert clear claim to his father's entire inheritance. But English law remained more flexible, and William had conquered that kingdom through his own strength rather than inheritance. If he chose to divide his realms, who could challenge him? During the brief intervals, when pain medication dulled his agony enough to think clearly, William began dictating his final political arrangements. His voice, barely audible above the sound of his own labored breathing, would shape the future of Western Europe for generations to come. England would go to William Rufus. The king's reasoning was coldly practical. His second son had proven himself capable of the ruthless leadership required to maintain Norman dominance over a still hostile Saxon population. Rufus possessed the military skill and political cunning necessary to crush any rebellion that might arise during the succession period. Normandy, by feudal law and tradition, would pass to Robert Curthose despite his current absence. William might despise his eldest son's weakness, but completely bypassing him would create a dangerous precedent that could undermine feudal authority throughout France. Better to honor the legal succession and hope that actual responsibility might finally force Robert to grow into his role. But what of young Henry? The king's third son had waited patiently throughout the crisis, never pushing forward aggressively, but always maintaining his position near the center of power. William recognized something of himself in the boy's calculating patience, a quality that might prove more valuable than Robert's birthright or Rufus's sword arm. 5,000 marks of silver, William whispered to the scribe recording his final will. Henry would inherit a substantial fortune rather than territory, wealth that could be converted into political influence when the right moment arrived. The decision was characteristically shrewd. Henry would have the resources to become a player in the coming struggles without immediately threatening his older brothers. The physical act of dictating these arrangements nearly killed William several times. Each word required tremendous effort, and the strain of concentration caused visible spasms to rack his infected body. Sweat poured from his fever-heated skin, soaking the already fouled bedding beneath him. His hands, once powerful enough to swing a sword through chainmail, now trembled uncontrollably as he tried to gesture emphasis to his commands. Yet, still the political machinery ground forward. Prisoners would be released from Norman dungeons, a traditional gesture of royal mercy before death. Churches would receive generous donations to pray for the king's soul. Outstanding debts would be forgiven. The careful choreography of a medieval royal death proceeded even as William's body betrayed him with increasingly violent symptoms. Brother Geoffrey watched these proceedings with growing alarm. The king's fever had spiked dangerously high, and the infection in his abdomen showed signs of spreading throughout his body. How much longer could sheer willpower sustain a man whose internal organs were literally rotting away? But William had one final card to play, a decision that would determine whether his carefully constructed empire survived or collapsed into chaos. The question was whether he would live long enough to see it implemented. William's final act of kingship would be performed while his own flesh liquefied around him, his commands issued through gritted teeth as internal corruption reached his vital organs. The dying conqueror was about to prove that political will could transcend even the most grotesque physical dissolution. September 5th marked a turning point in William's agonizing decline. The infection that had been consuming his abdomen for over a month had now spread throughout his body, causing his extremities to swell and his skin to take on the yellowish pallor of advanced sepsis. Yet, somehow, through sheer force of will, he summoned enough clarity to dictate the final division of his realms. The scene in his chamber would have challenged the strongest stomachs. William's body had begun to emit gases from the internal decay, creating an atmosphere so foul that even the hardened warriors attending him had to rotate duties every few minutes. The king's abdomen had distended grotesquely, the skin stretched tight and discolored where the infection raged beneath. Brother Geoffrey later recorded that the smell was so overwhelming it seemed to poison the very air we breathed. Despite this physical horror, William's political instincts remained razor-sharp. He understood that every hour of delay increased the risk of civil war once news of his death spread. The Norman nobility needed clear, unambiguous instructions about the succession, delivered with enough authority to discourage immediate challenges. Summon the scribe. William commanded through lips that had begun to crack and bleed from fever. His voice had deteriorated to barely a whisper, forcing everyone in the chamber to lean close to catch his words, a proximity that few could endure for more than moments, given the overpowering stench. The formal dictation of his testament required nearly 3 hours, interrupted repeatedly when waves of pain left the king gasping and writhing on his befouled mattress. Each time he appeared to lose consciousness, the assembled nobles would exchange worried glances, wondering if they were witnessing the actual moment of death. But William would always drag himself back to awareness, driven by an obsessive need to control every detail of the transition. William Rufus would inherit England, but with specific conditions attached. The new king must swear to protect Norman interests, maintain the existing structure of feudal obligations, and respect the church lands that William had granted during his reign. More ominously, Rufus was explicitly warned against trusting certain English nobles whose loyalty remained questionable even after 21 years of Norman rule. The arrangements for Robert Curthose were delivered with barely concealed contempt. Normandy would pass to the eldest son according to feudal law, but William's tone made clear his opinion of Robert's fitness to rule. The Duke would inherit the ancestral lands, but also the responsibility for defending them against French aggression, a task that would require precisely the kind of sustained military leadership Robert had consistently failed to demonstrate. Young Henry's inheritance was announced with characteristic cunning. 5,000 marks of silver represented an enormous fortune by 11th century standards, enough to hire substantial military forces or purchase key political alliances. William was essentially giving his youngest son the resources to become a major player in the inevitable power struggles ahead, while technically avoiding any direct challenge to his brother's territorial inheritances. But beyond these formal arrangements, William had one final political masterstroke to execute. On September 8th, with death now clearly imminent, he ordered the release of all prisoners currently held in Norman dungeons. This traditional act of royal mercy served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the king's concern for his immortal soul, won gratitude from the families of released prisoners, and, most cynically, ensured that potential enemies would not be freed by his successors to be used against the new regime. The practical effects of this order created immediate chaos throughout Normandy. Among those to be released was Odo of Bayeux, William's own half-brother, who had been imprisoned for treason several years earlier. Odo's liberation would prove catastrophic for the realm's stability. Within months, the ambitious bishop would be leading armed rebellion against William Rufus. Yet, even as he signed what amounted to his own political death warrant, William seemed grimly satisfied with his arrangements. He had done everything possible to ensure the survival of his dynasty and the territories he had conquered through 6 decades of warfare. If his sons proved worthy of their inheritance, the Anglo-Norman Empire would endure. If they failed, at least the blame could not be laid on insufficient preparation. The physical toll of these final political exertions proved devastating. By September 8th, William's fever had reached levels that left him delirious for hours at a time. His infected abdomen had swollen so severely that the skin had begun to split in several places, leaking putrid matter onto the bedding that had to be changed constantly by servants who could barely contain their revulsion. The king's breathing had become increasingly labored, each inhalation requiring visible effort as his body fought against the toxins flooding his system. His hands, once powerful enough to crush enemies' windpipes, now lacked the strength to lift a cup of water to his cracked lips. As dawn approached on September 9th, those keeping vigil could see that the Conqueror's legendary will was finally approaching its limits. The priory bell began tolling at dawn on September 9th, 1087, but William's household knights were already ransacking his chamber before the echoes faded. Death had finally claimed Europe's greatest conqueror, but his carefully planned succession was about to collapse into chaos within minutes of his last breath. The end came with shocking suddenness. After nearly 7 weeks of gradual decay, William had spent the night drifting between fevered delirium and brief moments of agonizing clarity, his body racked by the final stages of systemic infection. Brother Geoffrey, who had maintained his vigil despite the overwhelming stench, later recorded that the king's breathing became increasingly shallow as the first grey light of dawn crept through the chamber's narrow windows. Around the bed, a small group of Norman nobles waited in exhausted silence. The vigil had lasted for days now, with men taking turns to avoid prolonged exposure to the putrid atmosphere. William Rufus knelt beside his father's head, occasionally leaning close to catch any final words that might emerge from the dying king's cracked lips. But when the moment actually arrived, it was almost anticlimactic. William's labored breathing simply stopped. His fever-wasted chest ceased its rhythmic rise and fall. The eyes that had terrified kings and commoners alike stared sightlessly at the stone ceiling above. After 6 decades of reshaping the world through pure force of will, the Conqueror's will had finally been broken. Brother Geoffrey immediately began the ritual preparations for a royal death, closing the king's eyes and folding his hands across his chest. The priory bell began its solemn tolling, announcing to Rouen and the surrounding countryside that an era had ended. Within the chamber, the assembled nobles knelt briefly in prayer, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief, relief, and barely concealed calculation about what would happen next. Then something extraordinary occurred, something that revealed the true nature of William's relationship with those who had served him. As soon as the formal prayers concluded, his household knights began systematically looting everything of value within reach. The scene that followed would have been farcical if it weren't so grotesquely revealing. Men who had sworn sacred oaths of loyalty to their dying king now scrambled over each other to grab gold plate, jeweled weapons, and precious ornaments from the royal chamber. Expensive tapestries were torn from the walls. Silver cups disappeared into leather pouches. Even William's personal seal, the symbol of his royal authority, was snatched up by grasping hands. William Rufus, shocked by this immediate betrayal, tried to restore order, but found himself ignored by men who had been his father's most trusted retainers just minutes before. The new King of England discovered that inherited authority carried little weight when competing against immediate greed. Within less than an hour, the chamber had been stripped of virtually everything portable. Worse yet, in their haste to claim valuable items, the looters had torn away most of William's clothing, leaving the corpse nearly naked on the befouled mattress. The man who had once inspired fear across 2 kingdoms now lay exposed and abandoned, his grotesquely swollen body a pathetic monument to the futility of earthly power. The symbolism was devastating. William had spent his entire reign demanding absolute loyalty from his subjects, enforcing obedience through carefully calibrated brutality. Yet the moment his intimidating presence was removed, those same subjects revealed their true feelings by desecrating his corpse in their eagerness to profit from his death. Brother Geoffrey, appalled by this sacrilege, attempted to cover the king's body with whatever cloth remained in the chamber. But even the priory's monks seemed reluctant to approach too closely. The stench of decay had grown so overwhelming that it seemed to cling to everything in the room. The holy men who should have been preparing William's soul for judgment were instead struggling not to vomit in the presence of his corrupted flesh. News of the king's death spread with remarkable speed despite the early hour. By mid-morning, messengers were already riding hard toward England, Normandy's major towns, and the courts of foreign rulers who needed to adjust their policies to this new reality. But the news traveled even faster among the common people of Rouen, who had lived under William's iron rule for decades. The market bells that began ringing throughout the city carried an unmistakable note of celebration rather than mourning. For the first time in living memory, the Norman capital dared to express emotions other than fear when discussing their ruler. Shopkeepers whispered excited conversations about what changes might come. Peasants who had groaned under the weight of William's taxes allowed themselves brief moments of hope. Yet even as Rouen celebrated, more perceptive observers recognized that stability had died with the Conqueror. The carefully balanced system of loyalties and fears that had held his empire together was already beginning to fracture. Without William's terrifying presence to enforce unity, how long before his realm dissolved into competing factions? The corpse lying abandoned in Saint-Gervais Priory represented more than just the death of a king. It marked the end of an entire political system built around one man's ability to dominate through sheer force of personality. Now came the truly dangerous question: what would replace it? The bloated corpse that had once conquered England was now too large for its own coffin, but the monks of Caen were determined to force it inside regardless of the consequences. What followed would transform William's funeral into a grotesque spectacle that perfectly captured the violent absurdity of his entire reign. The immediate problem facing William's remaining servants was brutally practical. Who would actually bury the Conqueror? The canons of Rouen Cathedral, the most prestigious religious institution in Normandy's capital, flatly refused to accept the corpse for interment. Their official reasons cited inadequate preparation time, but everyone understood the real issue. No one wanted to deal with the logistical nightmare of William's decomposing remains. The rejection was unprecedented in medieval Europe. Kings, regardless of how they had lived, traditionally received elaborate funeral rites from the highest church authorities available. Yet William's death had been so physically horrific, and his corpse had deteriorated so grotesquely that even hardened clerics recoiled from the prospect of handling his burial. Salvation came from an unexpected source. Count Herluin de Conteville, William's maternal uncle, stepped forward to fund the transport and burial arrangements, perhaps motivated by family loyalty, or more likely by political calculation. Herluin arranged for the corpse to be moved to the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen, the same monastery William had founded decades earlier as penance for his controversial marriage to Matilda of Flanders. But first, William's remains had to be prepared for the 9-mile journey from Rouen to Caen. The practical challenges were enormous. After lying in the summer heat for several days while arrangements were negotiated, the corpse had continued its relentless decomposition. The smell had grown so overpowering that workers could only approach in brief shifts, breathing through cloth soaked in wine and aromatic herbs. Brother Geoffrey supervised the construction of a lead-lined coffin designed to contain both the stench and any fluids that might leak from the decaying body. But when the time came to place William inside, a horrifying discovery emerged. The coffin had been built to accommodate a normal-sized nobleman, not the grotesquely swollen mass that the Conqueror had become. The lead-lined box measured perhaps 6 feet in length and 2 feet in width, dimensions that might have fit William in life, but proved woefully inadequate for his current state. His infected abdomen had swollen far beyond normal human proportions, while his limbs had become bloated with the gases of decay. Simply put, the corpse was physically too large for its own coffin. What happened next violated every principle of medieval funeral practice, but desperation overruled propriety. The monks of St. Gervas, working with perfumed cloths pressed to their faces, began attempting to compress William's remains into the undersized container. The process required them to push and manipulate the swollen flesh, trying to force the corpse into a space it simply could not occupy. The inevitable occurred with stomach-churning predictability. As the monks pressed down on William's distended abdomen, the infected tissue finally ruptured. The explosion of putrid matter that followed filled the chamber with such overwhelming stench that most of those present fled immediately, retching and gasping in the corridor outside. Yet somehow, through a combination of desperation and professional obligation, the burial preparations continued. Additional lead sheeting was hastily soldered around the coffin to contain the mess. More aromatic herbs were packed around the corpse. The container was sealed as quickly as possible, though everyone involved knew it was a temporary solution at best. The funeral procession that set out from Rouen on September 12th represented one of the most surreal spectacles in medieval history. The sealed coffin, now leaking fluids, despite its lead lining, was loaded onto a cart drawn by black-draped horses. Behind it rode a reduced entourage of nobles and clerics, most holding perfumed cloths to their faces and maintaining considerable distance from the hearse. Even this grim journey faced unexpected obstacles. Bandits, apparently undeterred by the sacred nature of the procession, blocked the road at several points and demanded payment for safe passage. The irony was bitter. William, who had spent decades terrorizing the Norman countryside into submission, now found his corpse held hostage by common criminals who felt no fear of his posthumous authority. Each delay allowed more time for decomposition to continue inside the sealed coffin. By the time the procession finally reached Cannes on September 15th, even the lead-lined container could no longer contain the evidence of internal corruption. Dark stains had begun seeping through the metal, and the smell emanating from the hearse was detectable from hundreds of yards away. The Abbey of Saint-Étienne, William's final resting place, had been prepared for a royal funeral befitting the Conqueror's reputation. Elaborate decorations adorned the nave. Distinguished guests from across Normandy had gathered to pay their respects. The finest ceremonial vestments had been prepared for what should have been a solemn celebration of William's achievements. Instead, they were about to witness a funeral that would be remembered as one of the most grotesque spectacles in Christian history. The monks who had agreed to inter William's remains were about to discover that some promises are impossible to keep with dignity and tact. When William's corpse finally exploded inside Saint-Étienne Abbey on September 16th, 1087, the noxious vapor that filled the nave seemed to carry with it the accumulated sins of his entire reign. The Conqueror's final battle would be fought not against rival kings or rebel barons, but against the basic laws of physics and human decomposition. The funeral service had begun with all the pomp befitting Europe's most successful military commander. Distinguished guests packed the nave of Saint-Étienne Abbey, including bishops, abbots, and Norman nobles who had traveled from across the duchy to witness this historic moment. The elaborate decorations, expensive candles, and finest ceremonial vestments created an atmosphere of solemn majesty that temporarily obscured the horror of what lay within the sealed lead coffin. But even before the burial proper began, disaster struck with characteristic medieval unpredictability. Somehow, accounts differ on the exact cause. A fire broke out within the abbey during the service. Flames spread rapidly through the wooden furnishings and tapestries, creating panic among the congregation. Nobles and clerics alike abandoned all dignity in their rush to escape the burning building, trampling each other in their haste to reach the exit. The fire was eventually contained, but not before destroying many of the expensive decorations prepared for the funeral. More ominously, the delay allowed additional time for William's corpse to continue its relentless decomposition within the damaged coffin. By the time the service could resume, dark stains were visibly spreading across the lead lining, and an unmistakable stench was beginning to permeate even the vast interior of the abbey. Yet, the worst was still to come. When the time arrived to place William's coffin into its prepared sarcophagus, the stonemasons made a discovery that would transform an already problematic funeral into an unmitigated catastrophe. The stone tomb had been cut to standard dimensions, without accounting for the oversized coffin required to contain the Conqueror's swollen remains. The sarcophagus opening was simply too small. After all the delays, compromises, and indignities that had marked William's death and funeral preparations, this final obstacle seemed almost cosmically appropriate. The man who had spent his life forcing others to bend to his will now found his own corpse, unable to fit into its designated resting place. What followed was the inevitable result of 6 weeks of poor decisions, compounded by medieval incompetence. Rather than admit defeat and commission a larger tomb, the attending clergy decided to force the oversized coffin into the undersized sarcophagus through brute strength alone. Several monks positioned themselves around the lead container and began pushing, trying to compress it into the stone opening through sheer physical pressure. The explosion, when it came, exceeded everyone's worst fears. The combined pressure from the monks' efforts and the gases that had been building within William's decomposing corpse finally overwhelmed the coffin's structural integrity. The lead lining burst open with enough force to spray putrid matter across a significant portion of the abbey's interior. The smell that followed was so overwhelming that it seemed to transcend normal human experience. Contemporary accounts describe a noxious vapor that filled the entire nave, causing virtually everyone present to flee in immediate panic. Nobles who had faced death in countless battles found themselves retching uncontrollably as they stumbled toward the exits. Clergy, who had administered last rites to plague victims, abandoned their posts rather than endure another moment in that poisoned atmosphere. But perhaps most revealing was the reaction of the common people who had gathered outside the abbey to witness their former king's burial. Rather than showing horror or sympathy at this final indignity, many reportedly burst into laughter. After decades of living in terror of William's wrath, they found dark satisfaction in seeing his corpse reduced to such grotesque absurdity. The burial was completed in hasty, perfunctory fashion by a handful of monks who volunteered to endure the stench long enough to seal what remained of William's corpse inside the damaged sarcophagus. No elaborate ceremonies marked this final moment. No solemn prayers were offered over the tomb. The Conqueror of England was finally laid to rest in conditions that would have embarrassed a common criminal. Even death could not grant William the dignity that had eluded him in his final weeks. His tomb at Saint-Étienne became a symbol not of royal majesty, but of mortality's ultimate victory over worldly power. The elaborate monument he had planned, featuring bronze figures and towering sculptures, was never completed. The funds diverted to more pressing concerns by his successors. Centuries later, during the religious wars that tore France apart, Calvinist iconoclasts desecrated William's tomb entirely, scattering his remains and destroying even the modest monument that had marked his resting place. Today, only a simple black marble slab marks the approximate location where Europe's most feared king lies buried. If indeed anything of him remains at all, the horrific spectacle of William's death and funeral serves as more than mere medieval grotesquerie. It reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of absolute monarchy, the gap between the superhuman authority kings claimed and the very human bodies through which they exercised that authority. William had built his empire by convincing others that he was somehow more than mortal, that his will transcended normal human limitations. His death stripped away that illusion with devastating completeness. The man who had terrorized kings and commoners alike was ultimately defeated not by military strategy or political cunning, but by simple biological processes that no amount of royal authority could command. In his final weeks, as infection consumed his body and his corpse literally fell apart during its own funeral, William discovered the one enemy that could not be conquered through force of will. The Conqueror's legacy would endure through his children and the institutions he had established, but the man himself ended as all men must, as dust and decay, subject to the same physical laws that govern the humblest of his former subjects. In death, if not in life, William the Conqueror finally achieved true equality with those he had ruled.